I'd been lecturing for a number of years. Gave my first lecture in 1967. I'm a nuclear physicist who went astray and eventually got into ufology because the bottom fell out of the advanced nuclear and space systems business. And in 1978, I was speaking at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the college arranged for me to be taken to the local CBS station, I guess it was, television station. And I was supposed to do 3 interviews there in the morning to hype the evening program. And I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. And the station manager was embarrassed, didn't have cell phones back then, so, where the heck is she? She's late, and he knew I had other things to do because he knew the people brought me to the station. And so he's giving me coffee, he's looking at his watch. Out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? His answer floored me. He handled pieces of wreckage of one of those flying saucers you were interested in when he was in the military. What? Totally out of the blue. There was nobody else around. He wasn't joking. And I said, well, tell me more about him. Well, he lives over in Houma, Louisiana. I didn't know where that was. I've been there since to talk to Jess, who's long gone now. He's a great guy. We're old ham radio buddies. And I didn't know it at the time, but Jess had never told him anything. He had seen one of the newspaper articles in '47. And the articles that back at that time, they often put the hometowns of military people in them. And Jess was based here in Roswell, but he was from Houma. And when this TV guy asked Jess later on about the crash saucer story, Jess said, I can't talk about that. So, okay, he said, you ought to talk to him. He's a great guy. The reporter showed up, did my thing that night, had a great crowd at the university. So the next morning, I was early at the airport. Well, let's see. So I called information, got a number for Jesse Marcel in Houma, and called him. And I used Bill Allen, was his name, the station manager. Now, Jesse's one of the few people that could not possibly deny that he had something to do with it. As I found out later, of course, there were newspaper articles that mentioned his name all over the place. His picture appeared in a lot of places. So he could hardly say, I don't know anything about that. And so he told me his story. He didn't have an exact date. He was the base intelligence officer here, and on a Sunday, when he got a call from the sheriff's office about a rancher who'd come in with strange-looking stuff. Jesse checked it out, talked to his boss, Colonel Blanchard. He said there was nothing conventional there, all this weird stuff. And the boss, Colonel Blanchard, who went on to be a 4-star general, I might add, and was Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force when he died of a heart attack. I mean, he wasn't a dink. Said to Jesse, take one of our counterintelligence corps guys and see what's out there. See, the ranchers stressed that there was a whole field of this stuff out there, and the sheep wouldn't cross the debris field. That's what bothered him. Somebody's responsible for cleaning up this mess. We're talking out in the middle of nowhere, and as you may have noticed, there's a lot of nowhere around here. So just the important thing is that Colonel Blanchard said, take one of our counterintelligence corps guys with you. Now, why would he say that? Because his concern was spies. This is the 509th, the only atomic bombing group in the entire world, most elite military group in the world, handpicked officers, handpicked men, high security. They dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 more the following year at Operation Crossroads in the Pacific. Security was a very big thing. And the Cold War was heating up already. And if there's wreckage of some strange kind not too far from here, whose is it? I mean, certainly the colonel would have known if one of his airplanes was missing. And Jesse would have recognized the wreckage for what it was, because he'd seen airplane crashes before. So they go out, they spend the night in their sleeping bags. As Jesse told me, the rancher gave them a can of beans. And the next day they go out and see the debris field. And Jesse said what was remarkable was there wasn't anything conventional out there. You expect wires, you expect vacuum tubes back then, propellers, tags that say made in Oshkosh, something. There wasn't anything like that. So they filled 2 vehicles. They come back to town. Late at night, he stops at his home, shows his son, Jesse Jr. Now, he's still alive, and he's a very important part of the story. He wound up being a medical doctor, a flight surgeon, a pilot. He was a colonel who got called back in to serve in Iraq at age 68, mind you. Flew 225 combat hours with flak jacket and sidearm and helmet all the time in Iraq with temperatures up to 130, Called back in at 68. I mention that only because in the Peter Jennings mockumentary, as I call it, they interviewed Jesse. He didn't bother to mention that he was a doctor, a colonel, a flight surgeon, a pilot. Those qualifications would lend you to believe this guy knows what he's talking about. This is not some idiot we picked off the street, They didn't do that. Anyway, I talked to Jesse, Senior. He didn't have an exact date. And I knew that the summer of 47 was a very busy time for UFOs. There were 2,000 sightings in that summer, at least, that we know about. Not too long thereafter, I'm in Bemidji, Minnesota, and somebody else comes up to me, in this case, after a lecture, and says, ever hear anything about a crash saucer in New Mexico? Well, yes, tell me more. I got their name and address and stuff. I shared it the next day with William Moore, whom I had known in Pittsburgh, and we both lived there. He lived in Minnesota. He had a third story. An English actor named Huey Green had been driving across the United States when he heard on the radio in New Mexico about a crash saucer there. He figured by the time he got to Philadelphia, he was going from L.A. to Philadelphia, that there'd be a big fuss. There wasn't any. Now, he could remember the date. That second story, we didn't have a date. I had other people. Early July 1947. It wasn't a trip you made very often back then. So Bill goes to the University of Minnesota Library, the periodicals department, starts looking through the papers. There's the story, verifying what Jesse had said. It was headline stuff. I had one idiot tell me, well, it couldn't have been a big story. It was only in the Roswell paper. It was in evening papers from Chicago West, Chicago Daily News, Sacramento Bee, Los Angeles Herald Express. It was all over the place. Not on the East Coast, because the timing of the press release was too late for the morning papers and for the East Coast papers, New York Times, Washington Post, etc. The cover-up story went out 4 hours later. And I have, the Los Angeles Herald Express has the article, Army finds flying saucer, general thinks it's radar weather gadget. Same day. They'd already had the fix in. The next day's paper, General Ramey empties Roswell's saucer, and that was the end of that. So Bill found those articles. We started looking. They had other names in it. And remember, this is before the internet. This is 1978. We worked very hard. We found 62 people connected with the case. The first lucky break was that I called the Roswell Daily Record and started this. I said, I'd like to talk to the editor from 47. And, well, long gone, what do you need? I said, well, I've got these articles here that say that the base public information officer, I didn't know the base had been closed years before, a guy named Walter Howe taught, it spelled 4 different ways in the newspapers. Before I could finish the sentence, she says, oh, his wife works here. What? You don't expect a GI who's stationed in a small town, 25,000 at that time, 47, is still there in 78. So I talked to Walter's wife, talked to him. He had a base yearbook. Because of him, there's a museum, really. Very good reputation in the community and so forth, and a big help. And so we worked hard at it, 62 people by 1980 when the first book came out, The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. Bill and I kept at it. By 1986, we'd found 92 people. The old-fashioned way. Our phone bills were running very high, as you can imagine, back then. And then I instigated the Unsolved Mysteries program on NBC, which it was their biggest audience. When it was shown the first time, 89, the audience was 28 million. When it was shown the second time, it was 30 million. It was their highest rating ever. And they had calls from people. They have a toll-free number where you can call in. They had calls from people whose friend had told them about this, whose neighbor, relative, whatever. So it got a lot of attention. So it wasn't a case of people coming running to me or to Bill. We had to go find them the hard way. It's one of the reasons I resented the Peter Jennings program. They interviewed me for an hour here in town at a museum, not the UFO museum, but an art museum. It may shock people that there's more than one art museum here in Roswell. They interview me for an hour, ask sensible questions. They're wrapping up, and the guy says, Stan, don't you think if these things were real, that half the academic scientists would be working on UFO stuff? It's like waving a red flag at a bull. I said, those who can do, those who can't teach. If you want fancy technology, you go to Lockheed and you spend $10 billion in secret on stealth aircraft. You go to GE, you go to Boeing, you go to places like that. The academic world is publish or perish. The world of advanced technology is you don't publish, you don't say anything. You write technical reports, classified technical reports, you know. But it illustrated that many people have this crazy notion if it's research, it's done in academia. I spent 14 years in industry, GE, GM, Westinghouse, little companies like that. And, well, to illustrate the contrast, when I worked for General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department in Cincinnati, 1956 to 59, in 1958, we spent $100 million on that project. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. It wasn't 10 professors and 40 grad students. It was a major effort. And we did develop a lot of technology, and the program was canceled. And that's my history. 3 years, good stuff, cancel the program. Worked on nuclear rocket engines at Westinghouse. We successfully operated nuclear fission rockets on the ground. And the average academic knows nothing at all about this stuff. So Roswell has been an important case for me. I certainly didn't know when I had my first conversation with Jesse Marcel that 32 years, 1978. 32 years later, I'd still be, here I am in Roswell. But it's captured the imagination of the world. I've spoken in 16 other countries, in 50 states and 9 provinces, and whether it's Australia or Korea or Israel, everybody asks about Roswell. The thing is, it wraps everything up into one. Aliens are visiting, we've got bodies, we've got wreckage, we've got the government lying. That combines a pretty powerful package. And I get disgusted with the nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them when I'm being polite. Right here in this museum, at the 50th anniversary, I was here being interviewed, and the head of the skeptics group, now called the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, was in Los Angeles. We couldn't see each other, but we could hear each other. And he was asked about Roswell. Oh, I know what that was. Oh? Yeah, that PR guy just made up the story to get attention. Unfortunately, I was there to say, you don't even know his name, do you? Well, no. I said, well, I've known him for a long time. I've been in his home, talked to his family. The notion that the PR guy for the 509, the most elite military group in the world, would put out a press release without approval from the boss is absolutely absurd. Besides which, Walter was not only the public information officer, he flew 20 bombing missions, bombardier and navigator, over Japan. He was such a good navigator and bombardier that he was chosen to drop the instrument package in one of the 2 nuclear tests in 1946 in Operation Crossroads. These are the kind of people you have to have confidence in. That's kind of an important job. If you don't drop the instrument package right, it's a wasted test. We don't want to do that kind of thing. Well, 10, 11 years later, the skeptics again put out update on scientific side about UFOs, more baloney. And this time he says again, an unnamed public information officer put out an unauthorized press release. That's total balderdash. I mean, it's truly incredible because we had checked, did he get a hard time from people for putting it out? It wouldn't have been put out without the colonels saying, this is what you put out. And we talked about that. So Roswell is a significant event, and it brings out the worst in some of the debunkers. Those guys are only in it for the money. I had some guy call me. I wasn't going to call you. I figure you're just in it for the money. Oh, why's that? Well, I see in all these television shows. I don't get paid for them. What do you mean you don't get paid? I don't get paid for them. Well, how about Larry King? He doesn't even pay meals. He pays transportation and hotel. Well, but you get advertising for your books. I say, sure, look how much money they make from when I'm on the show from selling advertising. But it's crazy. I had another guy say, there was an article in the National Enquirer, you know, they pay for stories, implying that Jesse Marcel was, yeah, he was interviewed. I know. I gave the reporter Jesse's contact information because the new book was coming out. And that reporter does a much better job, he's dead now, than the New York Times did. What we have from the major press, it's a problem for all aspects of the phenomena. But you realize the Roswell case is the only one that the Air Force has put out 2 big reports on. And the first one's the size of the New York phone book. They've come up with 4 explanations so far. Flying disc. Oh, just a radar reflector weather balloon. As if the base guys couldn't recognize a weather balloon. They use them all the time around here. Jesse Marcel had a course about radar and weather balloons and stuff, and learning how to use them. He had a brief cruise going on long missions, the B-29s from here. They'd fly out thousands of miles. So you got to know weather conditions, it affects fuel consumption, all this kind of stuff. And Colonel Blanchard, I mean, goes on to become a 4-star general. West Pointer almost was the first one to drop an atomic bomb. And he doesn't recognize a weather balloon? But the newspapers bought the explanation, the third explanation. That was the mogul, super secret mogul. There was no technology about mogul that was classified. It was the purpose that was classified. He put up a string of 20, 24 balloons with sonobuoys and radio devices. The idea is to get a constant altitude balloon that would listen for signals from a Soviet nuclear test, because they think there's a layer in the atmosphere that signals can be heard thousands of miles away. There is underwater. We detect some stuff from a long ways away. None of the technology was classified. The launches they talk about, none of them fit with the dates when things were found or the descriptions of the wreckage. It's very lightweight, very strong material. The memory metal that you could crush, so to speak, and open it up and it would flatten out instantly. They don't make weather balloons like that. Then, of course, my favorite is the 4th explanation. Crash test dummies. They got to think we're dummies, but they fooled the New York Times. That's all that mattered. Now, I found the guy who was in charge of that program. His picture's here in the museum with one of the dummies, Sierra Sam. 6 feet tall, 172 pounds. He's taller than the officer that's standing next to him. I found the officer and I talked to him in person. He pointed out to me that for the test to be meaningful, ejection seats, for example, you don't want to put a pilot in until you're sure the seat works. You know, they needed the dummies, but they had to have the same weight distribution as pilots. So when you release the thing, you'd see what would happen that would match pilots. I talked to him. He pointed out to me that the dummies were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. Now, how do you morph that down to a little 4-foot tall guy with a big head? And also, it was noted that none of the dummies were dropped until 6 years after Roswell. So we got time travel for crash test dummies. That's utterly absurd. I'm waiting for explanation number 5. I guess it's coming. There's some people saying, oh, it's all a myth. It's created out of nothing. I'm gobsmacked, as the English would say. So Roswell has taken its share of attacks from the critics. The critic isn't even a good word. There are 4 basic rules for debunkers. It doesn't matter what the field is, the same techniques. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And do your research by proclamation. It takes much less effort than investigation. For example, we have SETI people, you know, S-E-T-I, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Nah, silly effort to investigate is what that really stands for, S-E-T-I. There is no evidence for UFOs, they say. Well, you won't find it in their books. I read theirs. They don't read mine, you understand. Number 5 was just issued last month. I talk about, in my normal lectures about 5 large-scale scientific studies. You never find them referenced in their books. What do you mean there is no evidence? You mean you're too lazy to look at the evidence that's there? And, you know, people accuse me of doing this for the money. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. His lecture fees were a lot more than mine. You're going to throw them out? What's the benefit to SETI? Let's face it, if aliens are visiting, who needs to listen for radio signals? Maybe you need to learn sign language, you know, the next aliens land. And the lack of science, that infuriates me. We're asked to believe that there are civilizations out there sending signals to us, not just broadband all over, but to us, having characteristics that are appropriate for our level of technology. Why in the world would one imagine that any advanced civilization would send us a signal using our crummy technology? I say crummy. We've come a long way, but we've only had radio for a little over 100 years. There are stars down the road, 39 light years away, that are 1 billion years older than the sun. And there are two sun-like stars, from a planet around one. You could look at a planet at the other and directly observe planets and prove that there's life there easily. Those two stars are 1 billion years older than the sun. And they're only 1/8 of a light year apart. Now, those things together would say that they would have been much more ahead of us, had much more incentive for developing interstellar travel. You got a neighbor, you know. And the notion, the SETI, part of the mantra for SETI is no colonization, no migration, no interstellar travel. And I can't imagine why anybody would make those rather stupid assumptions, frankly. Colonization or migration are important ways of distributing life. And I expect every advanced civilization, a couple of things I would expect. One, it would figure out how its star produces its energy. I mean, look around, that's where the mass of the energy is coming from, is from the sun in our case, and other stars. Having done that, you will figure out a way to use it. Now, we did figure out a way. We built H-bombs. First H-bomb, 1952. We figured out how the sun works in 1938. That's not very long ago. Somebody else could have done that 1 million years ago, even 1,000. Look at the technology of the last 1,000 years, for example, the last 100 years. We put it to use in 1952. We built our first H-bomb. Now, that was a remarkable achievement. Released as much energy as exploding 10 million tons of TNT. A big bomb during World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster. That's the big ones that the B-29 used to carry. 10 tons, TNT equivalent. First H-bomb was 10 million tons, and the fireball was 3 miles wide. And I wonder what the aliens said, what are these idiots up to down there? I worked on nuclear fusion rockets looking at the whole concept in the early 60s. And if you use the right stuff in the right way, and you wouldn't do it if you didn't, you can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket having 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. Not 10, not 10,000, 10 million times. So what I'm saying, within a very short period of time, every civilization is going to figure out how its star works and how to use that energy. I'm not saying there isn't something better. I'm sure there is. We are not a very advanced civilization. And progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past, just more of the same. More TNT. Fusion is a big step over TNT, but there's probably something more than that. But whatever it is, I would expect that they colonize the whole darn place out there for another reason. Every advanced civilization will also know that there may be something that happens that's catastrophic for them. Supernova, for example, fry it, but good. An asteroid, a plague, environmental stuff, a nuclear war, leaving pretty messy stuff. So you'd want to be sure there was some place to go to. And propulsion, I'm not saying fusion is the ultimate, but it's sure a heck of a lot better than trains and planes and chemical rockets. And so, you know, this concept of we're the smartest guys in the neighborhood, or we're as smart as anybody else. When we have such a short history in view of the long history of the neighborhood, that's absurd. And I get a real kick out of the guys who say if aliens were coming here, they'd have sent a signal first. Why? Columbus didn't send smoke signals to the natives. They're doing their thing. Dr. Stephen Hawking, one of the world's great astrophysicists, no question about that. As a nuclear physicist, I respect that. But when he starts talking about we shouldn't make our presence known to aliens out there because look what happened to the natives when Columbus came along. In the first place, the aliens have already come here. In the second place, the natives did not have weapons of mass destruction, nor methods for delivering them, nor spy satellites, nor radar installations, nor spending, well, the people on this planet are spending $1 trillion on things military this year. Now, of course, 30,000 children die every single day of preventable disease or starvation. That tells you something about our society. That's not a very pleasant picture as far as I'm concerned. I am trying to fight for people to be rational. That's why I got into book writing. I mean, I'm the Grandma Moses of the UFO book field, 5 books after I'm 60, You want to educate the world to think of things reasonably. And I found after the first 700 lectures, people will listen. They want data, they want facts, and also, and I found, it's kind of unexpected, what they really want to know, they'll accept the data, the studies, large-scale scientific studies, etc. They really want to know the answers to the why questions. Why would aliens come here? Why doesn't the government tell us what it knows? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? And they seem to like my answers to these questions. And I'm fortunate because I worked on advanced propulsion systems. I can deal with the questions like you can't get here from there. You can't. But also I've had to think about these why questions. And there's a whole chapter in my book, Flying Saucers in Science, about why come here. And many people don't realize that we are the densest planet in the solar system. Cubic foot on the average of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any of the other planets. And somebody says, who cares? Well, that means there are more heavy metals here. And heavy metals are rather peculiar in their properties. Uranium and gold, 1.5 times as dense as lead, both of them. But then there's rhenium and osmium, twice as dense as lead. And some of these heavy metals have very special high temperature properties, for example. They could have been mining the goodies here. And why did all those guys go west to California in 1849? Gold in them thar hills, to Alaska the same way. Those weren't easy trips. Those weren't tourists now. Uranium was used for just about only one thing back over 100 years ago. It was a coloring agent for pottery, makes a yellow glaze for pottery. That's illegal now, I might add, because it's somewhat radioactive. We didn't know that it had other uses. There's a whole technology developed with zirconium, the nuclear navy. The piping and plumbing of the nuclear reactors on board the ships and stuff is zirconium-based alloys. Had to develop a whole industry. Titanium for the YF-11, the fancy SR-71, those things. Now there's a lot of investment going into rare earths. Who gave a darn back 40 years ago? Now every Prius has got tens of pounds of the stuff. So aliens could have been stealing goodies from here for a long time, mining the bottoms of the ocean. There are nodules of all kinds of good stuff. We don't pick them up yet. There are millions of carats worth of diamonds that have washed off Africa into the ocean. And there are over 1,000 reports of unidentified submerged objects, USOs. So we don't know why they're here, but one can imagine that there are a lot of goodies. You see, if you can fly wherever you want and land wherever you want, take off from wherever you want, you don't even worry about, is there an airport nearby that I can go to and go get the goodies? Biological stuff. We have an enormous variation of biological life on this planet. Genetic studies. And you can think of all the professors with graduate students doing thesis work on the development of a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare, namely us. So how come we all speak different languages? Why are there several different colors of people here? These are interesting questions. Also, I personally think the major reason for checking us out is to quarantine us. Everybody I ask, if you were an alien, would you want us out there? Nope. Well, we're not very nice, to put it simply. So I think every advanced civilization is going to be concerned about its own survival and security. That means keeping tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood, but only close tabs on those primitives who show signs of being able to bother you. And isn't it amazing? Here we sit in southeastern New Mexico. In July 1947, the only place in the entire world where you could study the three technologies that would indicate that soon we'll be moving out, less than 100 years, which is nothing on a cosmic timescale. Powerful rockets, the B-2s that were being fired over White Sands. First nuclear bomb was tested over Trinity Site and White Sands Missile Range. And that's where we had our best radar to track the rockets. That's the forerunner of electronics. Now, I said that on an English television program, and a haughty English astronomer said, well, they could have gone to the Soviet Union. Sorry, they didn't test their first A-bomb until August 1949. We're talking July 1947. The only place you could study those is right here in southeastern New Mexico. So I'm not saying that's the only reason anybody would come here. But if I'm correct in assuming that anybody out there with any brains wants to keep tabs on their primitives, I'd expect them to be checking things out. And they did, apparently. I read a book, Edward J. Ruppelt's The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects in 1958 when I was a physicist working for GE. It intrigued me. Read 15 more books. I discovered Blue Book Special Report 14 with the Secretary of the Air Force lying through his teeth. That shocked me. When you work under security, sometimes you tiptoe around the truth. You can't reveal classified information, but you don't want to flat out lie. He flat out lied. But nobody ever came to me with classified UFO information. The rules about security. I respect security. I don't want technical data put out on the table. There's a guy named Osama out there and a few other guys who would love to get advanced technology. I don't think you put that on. You can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. I mean, they listen to the radio, they watch television, etc. So, in security, there are two important things. Level of classification and need to know. Just having, say, a secret clearance doesn't give you access to all secret information. You need to have a need to know. I ran across that. I was working on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes. The nuclear navy was working on radiation shielding for nuclear ships. Neutrons or gamma rays are all the same, doesn't matter. So I read the classified abstracts. They listed technical reports have been published in the last month. Every month they put out a list of these. Oh, hey, there's a report I could use. That sounds very good. Couldn't get access. The Navy wouldn't give me access. I had the right clearance, Q clearance, but wouldn't give me access. So one is well aware of the limits, and the penalties for breaking security are pretty tough. Death, life, loss of all benefits, minor details like that. Isn't it amazing? We've had one Daniel Ellsberg who released classified documents, the Pentagon Papers, and they were about to prosecute him when it was found that the Nixon guys had raided his psychiatrist's office. That's a no when it comes to how you handle things. So he didn't get prosecuted. But millions of people have had clearances. There aren't many of them, except spies, running around giving away classified information. So nobody was handing me classified stuff about anything. And it did, however, give me an understanding of how security works. I've been to 20 archives, presidential libraries, other places like that. Looked at a lot of stuff that, lists of stuff that couldn't be declassified. It goes with the territory. I mean, I got people telling me that, hey, Stan, they declassify everything after 25 years. Sorry, no, they do not. I'll guarantee you. That governments can't keep secrets. I don't know where these people have been, but the stealth program, again, $10 billion in 10 years. The NRO, spy satellites can cost $500 million each. Their black budget is estimated at $10 to $20 billion a year. Can't keep secrets. I had one of these SETI guys say, well, look, this is the same federal government that runs FEMA, and look what they did with Katrina. And they run the post office. They can't keep secrets. What's the connection? Tell me about the DIA and the CIA and the FBI and the NRO and the NSA. These are the guys you want to talk to if you're going to say secrecy or no. So I do have some special insights into these things, having worked on it. As a matter of fact, you sign a nice piece of paper when you leave a job that you will forever hold your peace. You'll never talk about what you learned. I had trouble getting a couple of my reports years later that had been classified. And I tried at the facility where I was working, they were still classified. And years later, I got copies because they'd been declassified over here, not over here. They don't notify you. I wrote the report. They didn't tell me. But I was glad. I've got a report that says secret restricted data, line through it, confidential restricted data, line through it, declassified over a period of time, a little date stamp there. So we live in a world in which huge amounts of time, money, people, effort are involved in classified activities. It should surprise nobody that we would want to keep the secrets of the saucers forever if we could. Not just technology now. Everybody'd like to be able to fly the way they do. Up, over, down, around, high speed, stop, dead, go straight up, etc., etc. But there are other problems. Who speaks for planet Earth? I mean, the silly question, we'll have to land on the White House lawn. Last I heard, the president doesn't speak for 6.5 billion Earthlings. Trouble enough speaking for 305 million Americans. But you know, it's one of those dumb questions. We'll have to land on the White House lawn. It's forbidden to fly over the White House. In 1952, there were loads of sightings over Washington. Airplanes, radar, etc. There are college-level courses being taught about UFOs. There have been a dozen PhD theses done. They're listed in my book, Top Secret Magic. One of the real complications for government is the need to give up power if people start owing their allegiance to the planet instead of an individual government. You don't need to look far to say that nationalism is the only game in town. Who wants to give up power who's in power? Nobody that I know of. And, you know, the American way will hold an election. Free and open elections for everybody. And then you say, wait a minute now, China's got 1.3 billion people, India's got 1 billion people, we only got 305 million. We're not going to hold an election, not one vote, one person. And there are people who don't want us to owe our allegiance to the planet. It's one of the reasons it's in such a mess. I mean, Eisenhower worried about the military-industrial complex, but there are other problems here too, whether it's the bankers, the environmental problems, profit to be made from having individual countries, individual groups doing their thing. I, for one, would like people to start thinking of themselves as Earthlings, because what I've found on campuses is that the younger generation doesn't have much trouble with the idea of there being life out there. They grew up in the space age. You don't know how anti-space travel the astronomical community was before 57. Sputnik went up in 57. The Astronomer Royal of England said space travel is utter bilge. Nobody's going to spend the money to do that. What would be the point, they say. What we should do is buy better astronomical equipment. And yet no field has benefited more from space than the astronomical community. But the kicker is, we don't know how to stop being militaristic and stop being humanistic. It's not just religion. Religions have been warring for as long as we know. But the power syndrome again. And I can feel sympathy for those people who see their power slipping. I can even feel sympathy for the Catholic Church with all these huge payoffs because of the sexual activity of priests. The church goofed by spreading around people who they already knew were guilty of being bad guys and sending them someplace else instead of punishing them. That's turned a lot of people off on religion. But I must say I was delighted when the Pope last year when asked about aliens in space or out there, said, well, God made us, no reason he couldn't have made them too. And my first reaction was, what does he know that we don't know? So that was very comforting. There are some religions who assume, the Muslims do, the Mormons do, the Hindus do, that there's civilizations all over the place out there. In God's house are many mansions, and there are other lines like that. What's really going on here is that flying saucers finished the job that Copernicus started of taking man out of the center of the universe. 1543, his book was published. He died that year, so he didn't get burned at the stake. He expressed the incredible view that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Supposedly everything moved around the Earth. He said the sun is. That's just one little step over. That still left man at the top of the heap. The book was banned for 300 years. It bothered a few people, to say the least. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake not too many years later. Flying saucers finished the job that Copernicus started of taking man out of the center of the universe. Because now that we know something about the age of the universe, the age of our society, and so forth, it's obvious we're not at the center of things. If aliens are coming here and we can't go there, we're lagging behind. Now, when the Brookings Institute study was done in the early 60s, they said, this is what happens if there's contact with extraterrestrials. The group that would be most devastated would be the scientific community, they said. These guys at the top of the heap who now know that they're not the big shots when it comes to knowledge and power and all that sort of thing. So there is a serious problem here. There's a problem for the journalistic community and the scientific community to admit that for 63 years they've been ignoring the biggest story of our days. Some people have trouble with admitting the error of their ways, so to speak. And one of the reasons that I got into all this stuff, as a nuclear guy, I'm very much concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I didn't work on weapons, but I know how powerful nuclear airplanes, nuclear rockets, etc. If I could do anything to get people to think of themselves as earthlings, to reduce the threat of nuclear proliferation, I have an obligation to do that as a nuclear guy. I used to say how many cubic foot of space would be taken up with explosive if you had an A-bomb go off in your house, to impress people. Many people, megatons doesn't mean anything to people. If you say 10 million tons of TNT, that has some impact, And I can speak about these things from my personal knowledge, having worked on some of these things. So that's one of the things that motivates me, is the need for an earthling orientation. And people say, you want to go to the stars? I say, no. I don't think we should send anything to the stars until it's an earthling vehicle, not an American or Russian or Chinese or Indian or whatever it's going to be. And so there are a lot of aspects of the question of flying saucers that can have an impact on all of us. New ways of doing things, more important, new ways of thinking about things, and new ways of recognizing the mess we're making of things. My new book, Science Was Wrong, we have a lot of examples. There are 14 chapters. Kathleen Martin and I each did 7. And we have many instances in which smart people have said stupid things that have stood in the way of progress. Thousands dying because new methods of treatment were pushed aside. That's not how we do things. That's not the way to do things, Aviation was slowed down by the noisy negativism of these people who knew that we would never fly. Space travel, the same thing. It's hard to get funding for something if the big shots tell you, hey, that's ridiculous, which was said 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight, man will never fly, by a great astronomer. So I'm out for enlightening the world, giving people choices, but make sure they know the facts before they make those choices. It's kind of, there's a chapter in the new book about global warming, evil CO2. And I try to point out to people, CO2 isn't the biggest greenhouse gas. Water vapor is, as a matter of fact. And furthermore, that plants absolutely need CO2 to grow. And if the levels get a little higher, they will grow better. And people look at me like, you sure? What benefit from CO2? It's not evil, darn it. Every farmer will tell you, I need the CO2. So I believe in educating, stimulating, exciting, putting the facts out on the table. I have a lot of faith in the average person's ability to reason if you give them the data. And I don't believe in this talking past each other with opponents. I've written a book about the Majestic 12 documents, which I believe some of them are the most important classified documents ever leaked to the public. They tell that President Truman set up a group called Majestic 12 to deal with crash flying saucers and the intelligence and technology ends of the whole saucer business. And I also believe there's well over 100 phony documents. But I try to dig out the facts and the data and to raise the objections of the non-believers and demolish them rather than ignore them. And so I've done debates with people, written a whole book, and I keep waiting for somebody to come up with a good argument against the documents, the real ones. It would be amazing if the government didn't put out garbage, so some of it rubs off on the real ones. Well, these are phony, so they must all be phony. Standard approach to handling things. So my mission, if you will, is to educate, stimulate, get people to laugh a little bit too, and to look at us, to see us as others must see us. Bobby Burns was right. We need that, to see ourselves as others see us. It's not a pretty picture. I thought my great-grandson, I have one, would grow up in a much better world than I grew up in. I mean, I lived in the Depression, the Second World War, the Korean War. Things were a mess. Things ought to be much better now. You know what? They're not. That bothers me. I'm not finished, but I want to do what I can to get things rolling in the right direction. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You have to change how you do things. I think I do, yeah. This is a laser pointer. They're impressive. The laser was invented just 50 years ago. This is not just a better light bulb or a better flashlight. The physics is altogether different here. We need to recognize that in human relationships, we need some new approaches too. Times have changed. The environment's changed. We need to change too in how we look at things, what we let governments get away with. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, somebody once said. So as long as I can have an impact on people's thinking, I'll do what I've been doing. Probably write another book next year. I've been very pleased to see that this past year, the press, starting in January, has been talking about aliens in a whole new way. There was a conference at the Royal Institute in England in January, 50th anniversary of Frank Drake's first search for signals from Tossetti and whatever the other one is. And because of the caliber of the people, the press discussion about this was on a reasonably high plane. No ha-ha stuff, standard approach to UFO coverage. Then Dr. Paul Davies from Arizona came out with his book, The Eerie Silence, talking about we haven't received signals from out there. Then Stephen Hawking made some rather strange, surprising statements, assuming there's aliens out there, but we don't want to give away that we're here. Now, none of these people talked at all about the UFO evidence. That was verboten. Theoretical construct, listening for signals, etc. Aliens would have sent us a signal first before they came here. It was one of those silly things. But I was heightened by, I was pleased by the fact that the press coverage treated the subject of aliens as something other than comic book kind of stuff. So I'm optimistic that maybe something is afoot. We need a Woodward and Bernstein to deal with the cosmic Watergate, as those guys did. People forget there was a lot of support for them from the Washington Post. We haven't had that kind of effort on the UFO scene. And I think we're much more likely to get disclosure, if you want to call it that, from efforts of somebody, doing a Woodward Bernstein. But that means institutional support. The biggest stumbling block is to having establishment groups admit that they had ignored the biggest story of the millennium for all these years. Nobody wants to admit that. It's easier to just go on the path we've been going, blind-eyed. Ain't nothing going on out there. There's a syndrome. I take great pride in my knowledge of the important things in the world, says David Susskind, for example. This is real. I read the New York Times. I don't see anything in there that says flying saucers are real. So they must not be. Because if they were real, that would be important. If it was important, I would know about it. I don't, so it must not be. And I'm not going to waste my time on something that isn't real. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, you see. I'm not going to look at any evidence. There isn't any evidence. If there were, I would know about it already. So this is what we have to combat. And if we could get the major media to pay as much attention to the saucer side of the equation as the silly stuff, the silly effort to investigate the SETI stuff, we'd be way ahead. And that's what I'm hoping will happen. I'm not a follower of Stephen Greer and his Disclosure Project or a couple of other ones for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want technical data out on the table. Why give it away to your enemies? If you've figured out anything, it's not just how the saucers work, but how to detect them flying in the atmosphere. Maybe there's something better than radar. You don't want to tell your enemies that. And there are enemies. Everybody's got enemies out there on this planet now. Also, if you're going to release information, it should be with a plan, say an international announcement, with conferences being forthcoming on the religious, the economic, the political impact of this. You don't change the world overnight. The states in the South that recognized that desegregation was going to have to come in, the guys who did the best job are those that had leadership that said, okay, we know our people don't like these new laws, but we know that they're law-abiding people and they will abide by them. What we're going to do is we will change the rules in the first grade this year, first and second grade next year, first, second, and third grade the year after. And pretty soon, we've got to change. Even though we haven't bashed people over the head, you got to think differently now. So we need procedures for the church, for the universities, for the press, to lead in a new direction. We haven't seen that so far, but it could be done, I believe. Once in a while, they wake up to the new world out there. And I think we will succeed, meaning that most people will be made aware, whether they like it or not, that there is evidence that there are aliens coming here, and that we are not the most advanced. That's the other part of that. And so you get new editors, get new professors, maybe the minds will open up. I'm an optimist about that. But I'm not joining any movement saying everybody is entitled to everything. I had people say to me, you don't think, aren't we as part of a democracy entitled to know everything? Absolutely not. I worked under security for 14 hours. There are a lot of things I'm glad haven't gotten out into the open. But since the government says these aren't a threat to the security of the United States, you better come up with a better justification for why you don't want to tell us what's going on. So I'm still an optimist. I think it would be something you'd want to do, is to get opinions and have leadership provided by religious leaders that are respected by at least their adherents. And I think most people appreciate the Pope as a man of peace. His slate isn't clean. The church's slate is hardly clean. But I think people will pay attention when a man like that says something. The chief rabbi doesn't much matter because there aren't that many Jewish people around. But the bigwigs in the other churches, other religions, Dalai Lama, etc., these could all together have an impact, to agree, maybe to disagree about some of the details, where this fits in our past history, but to recognize the need for opening up the scope of our own thinking about the universe. Not just us, And what if we are somebody's colony? Penal colony. That's why we're so nasty to each other. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here. Australia was settled by convicts, after all.
That's true.
They're proud of it, too. Georgia isn't so proud. But I think that there probably is still the equivalent of an Operation Majestic 12. And the analogy I like is you have your wagon wheel from a Western wagon without the rim. All the spokes going into the hub. Somebody's got to be at the hub, receiving the information and making sense out of it. These guys don't have a need to know what the guy in the other spoke knows, but somebody in the middle has to be there. And they'd look at technology of wreckage. What progress can we make in analyzing that? What we can learn from observations, say from cameras on board airplanes chasing UFOs. What we can learn possibly about radio transmissions picked up locally. I've had 2 stories of guys at a classified facility. There's a UFO sitting nearby. It's on radar, and the radio receiving equipment, the tapes are going around, and then the guards come in, the security people come in and take all those tapes. They got to talk to each other. Hey, I'll meet you for lunch, Joe. I'll be late for an hour, you know. So there has to be somebody in the middle who knows all of this stuff. Maybe somebody we don't even know whose existence. Because guys working under high security, many of them don't have a high profile. They don't want it. They're much better off if nobody knows that they're Mr. Big, kind of thing. So we have to have such a system, I believe. And how long it takes for a person to be read into most of the categories, I have no idea. And how much advice they give as opposed to just collecting and reviewing an evaluation, then they have to give it to somebody else. So who's the secret government? I don't know. It wouldn't be secret if I knew, obviously. But I think there has to be such a program. It's kind of like the Manhattan Project. As many as 60,000 people worked on that at one time, most of them not knowing what they were working on. When the needle moves over here, you turn this dial this way. This is at the facility at Oak Ridge, enriching uranium. They didn't know that's what they were doing. I think that it can be done. The question is, how do you go from this closed compartment with all these goodies to the outer world? And I don't know, maybe that's going on now. That's maybe where the Pope fits into the picture. It is hard to believe that you could make a peaceful life on this planet. I'm bothered, for example, by suicide bombing on such a large scale. And parents being proud that their child died as a suicide bomber, killing innocent people and children. I can't wrap my head around that. I can understand the Japanese kamikaze planes. You're in war, you've got a military plane, you dive your plane so it goes down the smokestack at a battleship, you blow up the battleship. Okay, I can understand that. But I can't understand a society which says it's okay to destroy wantonly all over the place. I have trouble with that. So I don't know how you get the planet all together. But anybody who expects that everybody's going to agree about anything is being unrealistic. There's nothing everybody agrees on. You know, the planet doesn't work that way. So, yes, I'm an optimist. I think a couple of things that will happen that will matter. The Kepler spacecraft is looking at a small chunk of space out there. Got a long orbit, and it's always focused on this one area, and it's getting data looking for planets around stars, especially looking for planets that are small like Earth. And they've released part of the data, and the rest won't be released for a while, so with Earth-based facilities, we can check out those things. But if it turns out that we've already found 460, the number keeps changing, other planets out there. If it turns out that they, just in this little chunk of sky, have come up with thousands, let's say, it's going to be inescapable that, hey, we live in a very much different place than we thought we lived. Ain't nobody out there? Can't say that anymore if we say that planets are all over the place. So how to include the latest in scientific stuff to try to have an impact on the political stuff, that's going to be a new challenge for people. I can just see courses at college, dealing with aliens. Yeah, I think that's right. And it's one of the problems about our society, is that we don't have the bigger interest at heart. I live in Canada, and I find most Americans don't know anything about the geography of Canada. They expect snow and the RCMP kind of thing. And of course, Toronto's the capital, isn't it? No. Here we are in New Mexico. There used to be a column in the magazine. Somebody forgot the 50th state, I guess it was. I tried to order something. They said they couldn't send it out of the country. I live in New Mexico. Do you need a visa to go there? Do you have to speak Spanish? I mean, totally ignorant of the place. So we need a lot more education. And we get sidetracked, global warming being one. In my new book, I talk about that. Big political issue, should spend hundreds of billions of dollars, not as far as I'm concerned. So we have a serious difficulty in dealing with issues that touch upon the planet, as opposed to individual countries or two countries side by side beating up on each other. I'd like to see more effort going into how do we deal with it. Call them geopolitical if you want. And I'm worried that we're not putting enough effort into it. But maybe this will be the year of the saucer.